Okay, we find ourselves on Chafei with Aleph 25a. And yesterday, posed an inquiry. The Gemara posed a question. And Gemara suggested a source that would be a possible solution, but then rejected that. And now we're going to introduce another. And essentially, the question is as follows. Can the husband retract the warning that he gives to his wife? At the beginning of the Sotah proceeding, it begins with the husband voluntarily choosing to, even though we discussed earlier whether he's obliged to do so, or whether he ought to or not. But either way, the Sotah proceeding begins with his issuing a warning. And the question is this the kind of violation that once the court learns of it, then the court takes over and the husband can't back out anymore? The charges cannot be dropped and the court has to see the process through? Or is this entirely a question of whether the husband is bothered? And if he is not bothered by this anymore, he can take back his warning and they go back to whatever they were doing before. This is where we left off yesterday. We suggested that maybe from the fact that the Beth Din can step in and issue a warning where the husband is incapable of doing so, perhaps that itself is proof that the husband cannot take it back. Because otherwise, why would the Beth Din do something? I'm sorry, reverse. Maybe that's proof that the husband can take it back. Because why would the Beth Din step in and do something that the husband is going to undo? To which we replied by saying, no, it could just be specifically in that case where the Beth Din did it without him knowing, then he can take it back. But if he does it on his own, he can't. So back to square one, we don't know whether this is indeed the case, whether he can or cannot take back a warning once it's been issued. Now the Gemara introduces another section of the Mishnah, another text that perhaps would settle this question. Yeah, with me?
Yes.
So the Gemara says, Tashma, come and listen. Come and listen to the following text that perhaps will resolve our issue. The Mishnah reads, and we provide for them, or for him, that is, after their warning is issued, and the husband takes her to the local court, and they determine that she is indeed a Sotah, and she must be taken to the high court in the temple in Jerusalem. So they provide for them Shnei Talmidei Chachamim, 2 scholars to accompany them from their town, wherever they are, up to Jerusalem. And explains the Mishnah, what's the reason why we are sending these 2 scholars to accompany them? Because Shema Yaveh Allah b'derech, lest he engage intimately on the way. End quote. Thus indicating that once she is determined as a Sotah because she violated the warning that he issued, and she secluded herself with this individual about which she was warned, she may not, the 2 of them may not be intimate with each other until the end of the Sotah proceeding, when it is determined that she is innocent after she drinks the water and survives. But until the time when she drinks the water, after she's been determined by the local court that she is a Sotah, the 2 of them may not be intimate. And thus they send 2 scholars to accompany this couple up to Jerusalem so that they maintain this law and they don't engage intimately. And moreover, they're engaging intimately would tamper with the effectiveness of the water as well. So this is an end quote from that text. The Gemara now says that perhaps this will resolve our question. How so? If you are to suggest that Baal Shemachal, that a husband who forgives his warning, he takes it back, Al Kinuyov, he takes back his warning, then Kinuyov Machal, then his warning is indeed rescinded and it is indeed forgiven, then why send 2 scholars? I think it's you pronounce it. Let him forgive the Kinuye to his warning, the Livel, let them engage intimately. What's the problem? we're sending along two scholars because it's forbidden for them to be intimate. But if he has an opt-out option, then what's the problem? Why are we sending two scholars? Let him opt out, take back the warning, and let them engage intimately. They go back home without going through the Sotah proceeding. So from the very fact, as the Gemara concludes, what do we need scholars for? So from the very fact that the Mishnah tells us that we do send scholars because they may not engage intimately, means, or seems to mean, that they have no way out. They are stuck going through the Sotah law. And thus we send the two scholars to make sure that they indeed go through with it. It's implied. It's right, it's implied. It's implied by the fact that we are sending the two scholars to hold them back from engaging intimately. It's implied that they have no way out. They must go through with the Sotah law, which then would mean he cannot take back his warning. Because if he can take back his warning, he has a way out. Forgive the warning, engage intimately, and go home. Says the Gemara, no. Perhaps the reason why we send the scholars is for this very reason itself. Digmiri, so that the scholars will teach the couple, that if they would like to engage intimately, Amrile, the scholars will tell him, take back your warning, and then Bala, then you can be with her. So perhaps the scholars are not there to prevent intimacy, period, but rather to make sure that if they do go through with intimacy, or if they do reconcile, and they decide that they want to live together, the scholar should be there to tell them, no problem, but please make sure you retract your warning. So the fact that the scholars are accompanied is not proof positive that he cannot take it back. Perhaps they're sent so that he can take it back, or so that he should take it back. So we're back to square one, which is, we don't know whether or not the husband can take back the warning. Perhaps the scholars are there to make sure that they never engage intimately because he can't take back the warning. Or perhaps the scholars are there so that if he decides to continue living with her, they inform him, make sure to take back your warning. So it's inconclusive as to what the scholars are accompanying them for, and thus we still don't know whether or not the husband can take back the warning. And finally, the Gemara introduces the following text, which explicitly resolves the issue. Tashma, come and listen to the following text, the following teaching, which will resolve the issue for us. Rabbi Yoshia said, Shloisha Dvarim, there were three things. Sachli, Zeira, who comes from Jerusalem, told me the following three laws. Me'anshe Yerushalayim, and he told us this information in the name of those who are from Jerusalem. And these three things are related, and they all have to do with taking back some legal proceeding. Right? We discussed this yesterday. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, that we have in civil law as well. There are some times when charges are pressed, and once the court is aware of these charges, the court takes over and the person who pressed charges becomes irrelevant to the case. And whether the person drops the charges or doesn't, the court goes ahead with it. And then there are some times when it's all dependent on the defendant. And if the defendant decides to drop the charges are dropped. So the Gemara is going to introduce three such cases, one of them being the case of a husband who issues a warning to his wife and tells us, and we'll discuss about each of these cases as to whether or not the one who pressed charges drop the charges. Namely, case number one, this is all coming from Jerusalem to Rabbi Yoshia via Zeira. Number one, Baal Shemach Lal Kinuyav, husband who takes back the warning, Kinuyav Machal, his warning is indeed forgiven. So here we have an explicit statement, and this resolves the issue, that a husband may indeed take back the warning. If he issues a warning, and he decides that they went to therapy and they resolve their issues, he can take back his warning.
This is from Jerusalem.
They
didn't know this
wherever they were, they didn't know this. And Zeira is telling us the information. The story's not over. So this is item number one. So this resolved our question. But the text goes on to talk about two other cases, and the Gemara is going to discuss those a little bit briefly. Case number two, Zaken Mamre. an elder who rebels. Without getting into too many details of this law, but essentially it's a rabbinic figure who rebels against the central rabbinic authority in Jerusalem. I don't want to get into all the details, but essentially dissenting opinions are invited in the legal process of Jewish law, right? In fact, in Jewish law, there is no singular judge. It's always in three, which means it's going to be a dissenting opinion, but you follow the majority. Here's a scenario where once the majority is concluded, someone decides to continue the rebellion and instructs people to ignore the instruction of the high court. This is a brief of it, but there's many more details in order for someone to qualify as a Zaken Mamre, as a rebellious elder. And the law is that this person is a rebellious elder. I'm not giving the full picture because it can go the other way, where the elder comes from somewhere else and he first rebels against the local court and then it's a rebellion against the higher court. It's a whole long story. But this is the bottom line. It's a rabbinic figure who is leading a people to undermine the authority of the centralized rabbinic authority. A Torah style figure, yeah, something like that. Yeah, not exactly, but something like that. So I'm prefacing that by saying that dissenting opinions are welcomed, but once the majority has been concluded and the law has been made, then the law must be accepted. Okay, so now the question becomes, what if the court wants to drop the charges against this rebellious leader? It's a similar kind of thing. The entire process is initiated by the court. The court identifies this individual as a rebellious elder, and there's a whole process by which they do investigation, going to multiple courts. And now the initial Bezdin who brought the charges against this elder decide they want to drop it. So in Jerusalem, they ruled, and this is what Zeida is telling us, indeed, they can drop the charges and it's forgiven. And case number 3 is Ben Soder Moida, the rebellious son. Again, the laws here are very detailed, nuanced, and complicated. But the short of it is, there's a very specific scenario, so specific that it's actually almost virtually impossible for it to ever happen in reality. But a theoretical, specific situation, which the Torah tells us, that if the child rebels under those circumstances, the parents can take him to the court and is capital punishment for this child. Now, I'm just going to put in parentheses very briefly that even though, as I just mentioned, the law is very hypothetical. I mean, it's not, I shouldn't say hypothetical, that's the right way to say it. The law is so specific that it makes it very difficult for it to actually happen in reality. That's a better way of phrasing it. Nonetheless, from the various different ways the verse describes the scenario, there's a lot to be learned about parenting. One of the big lessons to be taken from there is the phrasing of the verse indicates that there was a failure on the parents' part to have unanimity, is that the word, between husband and wife. That they weren't on the same page about how they educated their child, and that's part of the issues that led to that circumstance. I'm just making the point that notwithstanding the fact that the law is so specific that makes it very difficult for it to happen in reality, nonetheless, the text itself teaches us about parenting. Okay, back to our point. This rebellious child, who the parents now take him to the court, so the parents brought the charges against their child, and the parents now want to forgive him, they want to drop the charges. So says the law, he's forgiven. So the way Zeida tells us from Jerusalem is that all 3 of these cases, the person who brought the charges can drop the charges. Whether it's a husband who warned his wife, he can take it back. Whether it's a court bringing charges against a rabbinic elder who is rebelling, they can drop the charges. And likewise, parents who bring charges against their child as qualifying for this rebellious child, they can also drop the charges. This was his view. Now, Rabbi Yoshia, who told us that he received this teaching from Zeida, who brought this law from Jerusalem, says as follows: when I came to my friends in the south, the scholars in the south. And I told them what Zira told me from Jerusalem. So they said something very, very interesting. Al Shnayim Haiduli, they agreed with this ruling with respect to 2 out of the 3 cases. One of the 3 cases, they said, the charges may not be dropped. Now, if I were to ask you which of the 3 cases can the charges not be dropped, which one would you say? The case of the rebellious child, the rebellious elder, the Sotah. So it says the Gemara, Malzakim Mamra, for the rebellious elder, they didn't agree. If the court brought charges against the rebellious rabbinic figure, they cannot drop the charges. Why is that? Because now it's not a private issue between the 2 people. When it comes to a parent and a child, it's a private issue between parents and child. And if they can work it out, let them work it out. In the case of a husband and wife, it's also a private issue between husband and wife. And if he warns her and they have some issue in their marriage, so Torah provides an option called the Sotah law. But if they can work it out, go work it out. But when it comes to the rabbinic elder who's rebelling, it's not a private issue between the court and the rebellious rabbinic leader. This is a matter of public concern. You have a leader who's going to lead people astray. So the Bezdin isn't defended anymore, and therefore they're dropping the charges. Well, what about the leadership of the community? And therefore they said no. The Bezdin cannot drop the charges. Why? So that to prevent further disputes and splits amongst the Jewish community. In other words, a leader, okay, let's just focus on the law, and then I'll tell you what we can extrapolate from this. The law is quite simple. When the charges are a matter of public concern, because here's their leader who's breaking away from the community, rebelling against the community, and for all we know, he's going to split the town in half. So therefore, they cannot drop the charges. They have to see the case through to the end and try him and issue capital punishment if that ends up becoming the law, or whatever the law is in his circumstance. But the charges may not be dropped. Sending a message to the community that leadership is united.
It's no longer an individual concern.
That's right.
Only.
That's right. Now, what we learn from this is a very valuable lesson in leadership. In leadership, each person in their own circumstance, even as a parent, which is a form of leadership, or amongst colleagues, whatever form of leadership a person is in, one has to be very weary of false humility. Meaning, it's easy for a person, sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder, but sometimes it's easier. Sometimes a leader might say, I don't care for my own honor, my own respect. I don't have to someone was disrespectful or whatever, I can leave it alone. Sometimes that takes a lot of strength because the person is very personally disturbed, and forgiving is noble. But sometimes it comes actually from a place of weakness. You don't want to take on the leadership role of putting your foot down and saying certain things cannot happen. So you're going to guise that you're going to use the humility as like a guise to abscond yourself in your responsibility as a leader. Right? This is especially true with parent and children. I mentioned this here before, but I don't ever remember my mother telling me, "Don't you dare talk to me that way." I don't ever remember my mother telling me that. What she did say is, "You don't talk to your mother that way." You hear the difference? It's not, "I'm offended and therefore how could you talk to me that way?" It's, I'm a mother, and as a mother, as a father, it's my responsibility to teach you how to respect your parents. And therefore, you don't talk to your mother that way. I happen to be the mother, but that's not the issue. Yeah, because I happen to be the mother, but that's not the issue here. The issue is your responsibility as a child. The same thing is true in leadership of a community. One does not speak to a rabbi that way. It's not me. I happen to be the rabbi is a technical issue, right? So what the Gemara is teaching us here is, it's not a personal thing between one scholar and another scholar. And therefore, if one scholar decides he wants to be humble, we'll let it go. And the community is going to fall apart because you don't want to take on the role of leadership. Your child's going to grow up not knowing how to respect people because you don't want to impose on your child the issue of respect. That's to abscond responsibility. Remove yourself from the issue entirely, even though it happens to be against you, and ask yourself, what's the right thing here? What's the right thing for the community? that there be unanimous, cohesive leadership? If the answer is yes, then you have to put an end to split, even if it means you're asserting yourself. It's not about you. It's about the leadership in the community, or whatever form of leadership one happens to be in, whether it's in an office, whether it's in a school, in a classroom, with parents, whatever the form of leadership is, one has to pull themselves out and say, what's best for the community? What's best for the leadership? And if what's best for the leadership is that I be humble, humble. If what's best for the leadership is that I assert myself, then I assert myself, but not because it's me, but because that's what the leadership in the community requires. It's a very, very, very deep and profound lesson indeed. But coming back to our main thing, and we'll conclude with this, Shema Mina, this text indeed teaches us, derived from here, that Baal Shemachal Kinuyav, that a husband who decides to take back the warning he gave to his wife, Kinuyav Machal, his warning is indeed forgiven, because this is what was told from us from Jerusalem, and the sages in the south agreed, right? The teachers from Jerusalem give us 3 teachings, 3 types of charges that can be dropped. And when this was brought to the south, they agreed with 2, rejected 1. So everybody agreed then that if a husband wants to take back his warning, he may. Shema Mina, from here indeed we derive that this is indeed the law, that a husband can indeed drop the warning that he issued his wife. Tomorrow, God willing, we're going to get into up till which point can he take back the warning? And at which point is it too late? That, God willing, we'll get into tomorrow. A wonderful day, Eden, and a happy minor Shushan Purim.
All the very best to you, Rabbi.
The Code of Jewish Law says at the very end, the Torah is called Orach Hayim, which means the way of life. So it goes through I think I mentioned this the other day. Did I mention this yesterday?
Say it again?
Oh wait, no, yesterday was Shushan Purim Katan, not today.
Yeah, yesterday.
Oh, yesterday was the minor Shushan Purim.
Yeah.
Anyway, it still applies. The Shulchan Aruch at the end of at the end of Orach Hayim, at the end of the first section of the Shulchan Aruch, which goes through the daily cycle and then the yearly cycle. So it ends with the laws of Purim. At the end, it mentions the minor Purim. And the very last line is a quote from the verse, which I mentioned, Tov Lev Mishta Tamid. The happy heart is always feasting. It's always good to be in a good mood, always be good to be in a good space. So the Rebbe writes that even though the Code of Jewish Law doesn't state it, it's not just for the minor Purim that a person should have an increased meal, which is what the Code of Jewish Law says. And many have asked them to have a more festive meal in the minor Purim. But from the fact that then concludes the verse which says you should always be feasting, it's hinting that the next day, which is the minor Shushan Purim, you should also be feasting a little bit extra. Now, today is post the Shushan Purim, the minor Shushan Purim, but it's still Tov Lev Mishta Tamid. You should always be rejoicing and happy, especially as you're an other. Anyway, a wonderful day, buddy, and God willing, tomorrow we continue.
All right. Thank you.
Yeshua, Rabbi. God bless you. All the very best.